Beyond the Books is a podcast from the University of Edinburgh's School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at research and the people who make it happen. I'm Emma Aviat, a PhD student of English literature and current postgraduate web and communications intern. In this episode of Beyond the Books, I speak with Dr. Peter Davies, professor of modern German studies in the Department of European Languages and Cultures. We recorded this podcast before he started his Leverhulme Trust Major Research Fellowship last September, titled How Are Victims' Voices Heard? Interpreting and Translation at a Holocaust Trial, which explores the work of translators and interpreters in the trial of 22 former SS Auschwitz personnel in Frankfurt in the mid-1960s. I get to ask him all about his hopes for this project, as well as speak about some of his past articles that focus on one of the most prominent interpreters from the trial, Wera Kapkajew, and how she helped give a voice to dozens of Holocaust survivors. This leads us to discussion of the many concerns and roles that an interpreter in these institutionalized settings plays, and the crucial role of translation in defining public perceptions of the survivor experience, both in the past and potentially in the future. It was a fascinating discussion, so thanks so much for giving it a listen. Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Whenever I have this podcast, I always try and ask all my guests a little bit about their background and how they came to the University of Edinburgh, and for you specifically, the Department of European Languages and Cultures. Would you mind giving us a bit of insight into that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an amazingly exciting story.
Fair enough.
But, I mean, I took a degree in German and Russian at Manchester University in the 1980s, so it's a fair while ago now, and that's my background is in modern foreign languages. I spent some time. I did my undergraduate year abroad in Berlin and Moscow. This was like just before the end of communism, so I was able to see it from that kind of angle. And since then, I did a fair amount. I worked as a translator a little bit to try and fund my PhD later on, and worked as an English teacher and sort of did various things in various parts of the world, but was asked whether I wanted to do a PhD in Manchester again. It's one of those things that I never really thought a PhD was the thing I wanted to do, but you need somebody to come and approach you and sort of say, well, actually, why don't you think about this? And that's what happened to me. So that was really great. And my PhD was actually on East Germany, right? And East German culture, the sort of relationship between Soviet cultural policy and the work of East German artists in the sort of the early period of East Germany up to the mid-1950s. So I've moved away a little bit from that in recent times. But then I went and worked in Germany for a couple of years as a language teacher, and came back to Manchester, got a postdoc there, and basically moved to Edinburgh after looking for jobs for a while. Came to Edinburgh in 2000 and have been here ever since.
What originally, if you don't mind me asking, drew you to modern languages just as an undergraduate level?
Yeah, undergraduate level. Well, it was a thing I was strongest at school, really. I mean, I found that I have this kind of brain. Grammar I find really interesting, and also I really love the kind of literature and culture of the things that we were looking at school. And Russian in the period, it was glasnost and perestroika. It was seemed like an attractive kind of thing to do. It had a future to it, and there was lots of people studying it at the time. So I went into it then. It then went out of fashion for a while, but obviously in recent years has come back in, and I'm now very, very glad that I did it, I have to say, because it's helping me follow some of the things that have been going on very recently, sort of immediately, with some of the kind of social media stuff coming out of Russia and the protests that people have been holding there.
Yeah, no, there's definitely parallels. I think that's why I was so excited to speak to you right now. I think I really relate to what you're saying. Like, it's one of those things that you're strongest at. I think a lot of us in this school will probably realize that's a very strong motivating factor. And you're like, this is me, this is what I'm good at. So speaking of being good at it, I know you were recently awarded a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship Award for your project, How Are Victims' Voices Heard? Interpreting and Translating at a Holocaust Trial, which, congratulations, by the way, that's amazing. So what are some of your research goals for this project, and what are some of the questions you're looking to explore?
Yeah, the project concentrates on a single trial in the mid-1960s in West Germany. It was the trial of 22 former Auschwitz guards. There's quite a long prehistory to it as well, but it's sort of from 1963 to 1965 was the actual trial, the actual public trial, and it wasn't the first trial in West Germany. And obviously you had the Nuremberg trials, but then once West Germany had been founded in 1949, there were a couple of other trials, former SS people there, but this was the most high-profile one, and also it's the largest one. I think it's still the largest criminal trial in German history, as far as I know. And you had these 22 defendants, but you also had several hundred witnesses as well being invited. The whole thing went on for about 18 months. And a lot of these witnesses were former concentration camp inmates, former political prisoners, Jewish prisoners, some Soviet prisoners of war, various other kinds of people. Lots of different victim groups represented there. And what I'm looking at is the testimony of a lot of these witnesses, and in particular the work of the interpreters who were making their voices available, which is why this trial, one of the reasons this trial was such a high-profile thing in Germany was they had these witnesses arriving in Frankfurt and speaking directly to a German public for the first time, more or less. People have been watching the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem shortly before them, but that was in a different country. This was very, very immediate. You could see these people in front of you. There's lots of TV and sort of radio reporting as well as newspaper reporting. So there was quite a lot of public interest. And the interpreters are there making their voices comprehensible and available to the court, but also to the public. Not all of them needed an interpreter, of course. There were German speakers there as well amongst the victims, but many of them did. And you have 11 different languages being spoken and interpreted. Polish was the most important one, but there are witnesses in all sorts of different languages as well. So that's the context of the trial. I have 3 quite concrete goals and one sort of vague aspiration that I don't really know whether it's going to work out or not, right? So what I want to do is to describe a trial as a workplace for translators and interpreters. Think about the really concrete, their professional context. So their working practices, their pay, the attitudes to them as professionals in the court, and how they deal with the power dynamics of a courtroom. Now, that's quite a big deal in interpreting research already, but this is quite an extreme example where you have people who are Holocaust survivors coming into a courtroom where German is being spoken, the language of the Nazis. They can see these 22 SS men staring at them from the side of the court. They're standing right in the middle. There's quite a big crowd of people, a big public there, and they're being challenged and questioned. And the interpreters are sort of mediating there as well. They're sometimes the only person that these witnesses can actually speak to. So how do the interpreters actually deal with this? Whose side do they feel they're on? And what does that mean for their professional practice? Because all the interpreting research that people do has shown that interpreters are more than just channels. They're not just mouthpieces. They're not neutral, but they sort of organize the testimony situation and they make ethical choices about how to translate moment by moment. So I want to look at that. And we have recordings of these testimonies to listen to as well, which allows us to make that kind of judgment. The other thing is to shift the perspective away from the interpreters, but also to look at the witnesses, the victims themselves, who are obviously the most important people here in this trial. Not really thinking about them as legal witnesses. I'm not so interested in their testimony in terms of its value as legal evidence, but more about how their stories are told, how they formulate their experiences through translation, and how their voices can be heard in that situation, how they actually feel about it. The third aim is to contribute to ongoing extensive research on trial interpreting. There's a lot of research on this, not just Holocaust and genocide trials, but actually all sorts of different kinds of criminal trials as well. I want to try and contribute to that. So we have a specific kind of interpreting. It's consecutive interpreting, so the person speaks and then pauses, and then the interpreter speaks and translates. That's quite different from the sort of war crimes tribunals like Nuremberg or the Adolf Eichmann trial, or perhaps the trials of in the former Yugoslavia, for example, the trial of Slobodan Milosevic, where you had this simultaneous interpreting of interpreters in booths who are sort of talking simultaneously like they do at the United Nations or in the EU. With consecutive interpreting, the interpreters are sitting right next to the witness. So there's a personal relationship between them. And you really concentrate on the voices of both people. So it draws attention to the voices, it draws attention to the fact that there's translation going on, and the speech and the qualities of voice in the way that other kinds of simultaneous interpreting through these electronic devices doesn't necessarily do. So it's quite a different sort of situation. So that's the third one. The aspiration is to try and put the trial in a different context that's not really to do with legal history, but I want to think about it in terms of attitudes to migration and linguistic diversity in Germany. The 1960s is a time of mass labour migration to Germany, and the government is thinking about language services and what it means for people to be encountering bureaucracy and encountering the workplace with limited language resources. And I think there's some connections to make there with the trial. So I don't know whether that will come off. It'll depend what I find in the archive, but that's what I want to do.
It sounds absolutely fascinating and very important. I think that the real immediate implications of this, like you said, that seem very obvious. But then also just to reframe that history will be something that is so important to be able to do. So I'm looking forward to following it. I know you're just at the beginning now.
There's so much material. So I need time to really get to grips with listening to these testimonies over and over again and analysing them using various methods, and that's the thing that's going to take the longest. I'm hoping that writing it up afterwards may not take quite so long, but we'll see. 2 years ought to do it.
I know part of that time will be spent going on archival research trips. Where are some of the places that you're going to be going, and where are these archives that you're going to be looking at?
The most important ones for me are around the Frankfurt area. There's the research institute, the Fritz Bauer Institute, that's named after the public prosecutor of Hessen, who was instrumental in getting this trial set up in the first place. They have an extensive archive about the trial. They also curate the recordings of the trial testimony as well. So I'm going to be going there to work, and they were really helpful and supported my application as well, which I'm really grateful for. Also, the sort of state archives of the state of Hessen, which is the state that Frankfurt's in, they have a lot of material based on their justice ministry, and I'm going to be going through that to see what I can find out about the background of the trial. I need to try and find some biographical information on the interpreters, which is a little bit harder to come by because there's quite a lot of data protection issues to deal with there with private people who aren't kind of public figures. So I'm just going to see what I can get there when I'm thinking about their employment conditions and this kind of thing. But the most important one for me is the archive of the trial, which fortunately for the pandemic period has been all digitized and is freely available. These recordings are freely available online as curated by the Fritz Bauer Institute, which is fantastic. The reason that's happened is that this archive of this particular Auschwitz trial has got UNESCO status. So UNESCO Memory of the World status. I think it was awarded in 2017, as far as I remember, which means there's lots of resources available for it to be digitized and sort of made available publicly. So that's been really helpful to me during the pandemic, but also will hopefully, I won't need to spend so much time over there. I can do a lot of the work from Edinburgh.
Yeah, I feel like one of the only positives that came out of this pandemic was the fact that so many archives became digitized and are now so much more accessible. Yeah. And you were speaking about privacy and that kind of loss of it. And that made me think about the article that you wrote, The Interpreter of Horrors, the interpreter Wera Kapkajew, and the first Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, 1963 to 1965, where you talk about an interpreter who achieved minor celebrity status among observers of the trial and journalists for her work translating Holocaust victims' testimony. This was a pretty interesting feat, you state, given that other interpreters who took part in the trial didn't receive that much attention. So could you tell us a little bit about what was so unique about Kapkajew's interpretation style, and why did it become so important to the trial?
She's a really fascinating figure. I haven't been able to establish every biographical detail about her, and then there are some things that I'm not entirely sure about. But she was a Russian sort of anti-Bolshevik emigre, was born around about the time of the Russian Revolution. Her family then left and ended up in Vilnius, which was in Poland in that period, and she grew up bilingual in Polish and Russian. Studied law in Vilnius, and then at some what I think, and I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think there are hints that she was married to a Russian sort of Nazi collaborator, I think. Someone who joined the fight against the Bolsheviks on the side of the Germans. There's a lot of gaps in her biography. It's the kind of biography, mid-20th century, Central Europe, where there's always got gaps. People don't want things to be talked about. So I'm not 100% certain about this yet, but I think that's the case. And they ended up in Germany, West Germany, after the war. If he is the person I'm thinking of, he will have fought with the Waffen-SS at some point, and therefore would have wanted to avoid being captured by the Soviets. And presumably summarily executed for being a traitor. So they ended up in West Germany and ended up living there because plenty of these people were able to make a life in West Germany after the war. If that is the case, that's her background, it makes her work translating for a war crimes trial really interesting, uncomfortable, and emotionally quite difficult, I think. But what she has is an incredible sort of sense of being able to think her way into a voice, if you see what I mean. So she's a lawyer, she understands the legal system, but she studied interpreting. She is incredibly fluent in 3 languages, so Russian, Polish, and German, and is able to interpret between them. And she did most of the interpreting work for the Polish-speaking witnesses, who was the largest group. She also interpreted for the Soviet prisoners of war as well, who were speaking Russian. So basically, she was the most visible translator. She has a real sense of being able to sort of recreate a voice, for the listener. She's very good at that, and that's one of the things I think that people responded to, and thought of her really as somebody who ventriloquized these witnesses, these awful experiences that they're relating. She was able to sort of imitate their intonation, their manner of speaking, find words to convey things that are really very difficult to convey in language. Now it's not quite what she's doing. Sometimes because as an interpreter, you're always between 2 things, right? You're working for the power structure, you're working for the institution, and you need to prove to the institution that you can do your job right because your job relies on it. On the other hand, you're listening to somebody who's sitting right next to you, telling you an awful story, and who is relying on you to support them. So she moves backwards and forwards. Sometimes she kind of tidies up people's stories a little bit. If they're not quite able to say what they want to say, she will tidy it up and present it to the court in a way that they can understand. But on other occasions, she will sort of act as a part of the disciplinary apparatus for the court. So if people move off the subject, she'll bring them back onto the subject. As an interpreter, you shouldn't be doing that, but she sort of feels quite involved in the situation. And I think it's partly also all the court personnel and all the accused are men. A large number of the witnesses are also men. There are female witnesses as well, but basically she's a female voice here in this situation that's dominated by male voices. And I think the visibility of her as an agent in that situation probably comes from that too. And part of the way people judge female voices as being more about emotion and identification rather than sort of rational distance. I think people are judging her in that way. Whereas she's just trying to do a professional job. That's how she sees her job. I think that was a slightly complicated way of describing it, but I was trying to paint a sort of picture of her as a personality, really.
No, but one thing that I really noticed in that article, and if you want to expand on this more, is that you really speak about Kapkajew in 3 parts.
Yeah.
One that focuses on how the public saw and responded to Kapkajew, another how the witnesses received her, and then kind of finally the institutional views of her. Yeah. And as you said, this is at the end of the day this very institutional role, or within the trial settings. So how did the views on this role of court interpreter change between these different positions?
Yeah, It's really interesting, and they're very, very different. So I'm interested in the public discourse about the witnesses. I mean, there was a lot of press reporting on it. Plus, there was some TV and sort of radio stuff as well. Lots of interviews with people. There were some reporters who stayed there for the whole time, just reporting day by day by day on what was being said. And occasionally they mention the interpreters. There's also a certain amount of research on the witnesses and their attitudes to being interpreted. And also there's the idea of the institution and its kind of professional standards as well, which were sort of undergoing review at the time. Now, public commentary is really interesting. And I think a lot of what we can talk about ideas of kind of trust and identification. There's a really interesting book by a Polish scholar called Małgorzata Triuk, who has written about interpreters working in Poland, in post-war Poland, and war crimes trials. And one of the things she says is that the most important resource that an interpreter has to bring is trust of the people that she's working with, right? And that is actually more important than linguistic accuracy, right? So people she's working with have to be able to trust her. So the institution has to be able to trust her. The people that she's interpreting for have to be able to trust her. Sometimes these different forms of trust clash with each other. What Kapkajew is really good at is presenting herself as a trustworthy actor here. One of the reasons that the public commentary, the sort of journalistic commentary on her work is so focused on her is that she was obviously incredibly competent, and they had a lot of problems with finding interpreters who could do the job, right? Some of them just really couldn't. They employed people who turned up at the trial and just fell to pieces. They really couldn't cope with the material. She wasn't the only one who was that competent, but she was the one that was doing the most work, right? So she became a sort of minor celebrity, and there were a couple of interviews with her. Sort of journalists interviewed her about her life and her attitudes to what she's doing, and they talk about her. This is where this quotation, "the interpreter of horrors," comes from. It's a journalist writing about her as the person who makes available to us an understanding of the awfulness of the experiences of these Auschwitz victims. So in other words, she's an incredibly important person. She's like a conduit for this sort of awfulness. And also just the fascination of somebody. How does she feel about doing it? What's the power that she has in the courtroom to sort of shape a testimony. There's that kind of fascination. And there's a lot of questions about her family, the standard things that journalists ask of sort of female celebrities. You recognise quite a lot of this sort of stuff there, but they're just interested in her as an individual, as somebody who's, if you like, a conduit for emotion and trying to give words to things that there are no words for. They see her in that kind of way. So they don't see her as a kind of a legal professional. They see her as something slightly more, if you like, mystical or literary or something. The witnesses are quite different. There's a brilliant oral history project by the scholar Daggy Knellison, who has interviewed, I don't think there are any or very many who are still able to be interviewed nowadays of the witnesses, but she, a number of years ago, interviewed quite a few. And a few of them talk about Kapkajew. They don't mention any of the other interpreters because she's the one everybody remembers, right? And they talk about how it felt to be interpreted. And rather than portraying themselves as these kind of passive, suffering victims, which is the way perhaps the reporters would talk about them, they portray themselves as people who are actively making their case and making their point and trying to talk about the things that they want to talk about. And they remember her as being this kind of charismatic presence. Part of this is kind of projection, sort of nostalgia. But they say that she was, one of them says, she presented my words better than I was able to say them. Which, again, is not exactly what an interpreter is supposed to do in a court. But she was very grateful for it, she says, that she was, this very eloquent woman was able to speak for her. Another one says she was great because I could hide behind the time it took to interpret things in order to gather my thoughts for the next thing I wanted to say. They also, if you listen to the recordings, they will often speak to her directly rather than addressing the judge. They might ask her questions for information about what's going on. They'll ask, if they don't understand the question, they'll ask her about it. All the things that actually under professional codes of practice nowadays are not supposed to happen in courts, but actually often do, as research tells us. And you can hear that happening sort of moment by moment, that she presents herself as somebody who's trustworthy for them, is able to, that they can rely on, and therefore they're happy about the way their words are being presented. So that's, if you like, that kind of trust. It's a sort of an emotional, personal connection to somebody that you develop. The institution needs a different kind of trust, right? It needs a trust that's based on professional norms, qualifications, bureaucracy. So the interpreters who work for the court are qualified, they have particular qualifications, they're certified, they've sworn an oath, which then guarantees that they take responsibility for the accuracy of what they do. Which means, of course, that the court can then forget about interpreting as an issue, and if things go wrong, then the interpreters get blamed. Right, so it's not the problem of the way the court is set up, or the power structures in the court, or the linguistic ideologies of the court. It's the interpreters who are causing the problem. And Kapkajew is very good at presenting herself, when necessary, as a professional who understands the legal issues. So she can present herself in these different ways depending on who is actually asking the question.
I mean, it's really interesting reading all of this, because you frame this article so well, because you go into all these different evaluations of her, and it's really clear to see how they are shifting. And then I think what was so impactful is that you kind of end with how she sees it. And after talking about these journalists and what ideas they really wanted to project onto her, and then her response to it. So could you kind of give us a little bit of an idea of how Kapkajew evaluated her own work compared to all these different external ideas of her?
The important thing about Kapkajew is that she's the only one of these interpreters that we really have any evidence for. There may be people's private correspondence and diaries kept by their families, their children, of the other interpreters. I don't know whether it's going to be possible to excavate that kind of stuff, or whether people are really going to want that sort of stuff to be talked about. But it's very different from the Nuremberg trials, where we get a lot of memoirs by interpreters of all the different Allied powers. So you get ones from the American side, you get Soviet interpreters writing their memoirs, you get people from Germany writing their memoirs. They were really aware, I think, that they were making history, those people. Not only because of the importance of what they were doing at Nuremberg and the international profile of it, but also because of the technology that was being developed for simultaneous interpreting there, which was very new. So they were all writing about it. They were very excited to write about it, and their personalities were very important. In Frankfurt, there's none of that. They're trying to present it as a normal trial, done under normal trial conditions, which it actually, of course, isn't. But the interpreters are just professionals. So I imagine some of them just thought, well, I'm going to turn up, I'm going to do my job, and then I'm going to go away. Clearly, it's very difficult when you're dealing with that kind of material, but they may have had that sort of attitude and just went off and did something else. Kapkajew is really different, partly just because of the amount of work that she did and her profile. And she's aware of the importance of it. So there's a couple of, for example, the newspaper interview that I mentioned for one of the major Frankfurt newspapers. There's also a fascinating interview with Dutch television. Dutch TV did a sort of a documentary about the trial near the end of the trial. Now, clearly, trial participants weren't allowed to give these kinds of interviews while the trial was going on, so she had to wait until it was nearly over before she could do it. And she's asked about how she works, and she says she's always trying to catch the truth of an individual voice. That's how she says it there. She also says she feels like she's living through the testimony with the witness. There's a lot of really interesting kind of statements about how she feels about what she's doing. She doesn't quite say that she identifies with them, because actually that's kind of impossible when somebody's telling that sort of story. But she talks about accompanying them through the testimony, right, as a kind of a personal guide almost. She also talks about the emotional toll that it takes on her. She's obviously, these testimonies are very long, right? Sometimes they go on for a whole day, and you, as the interpreter, that's a very long shift. and it's exhausting physically anyway, whatever you're doing. But the emotional toll of it is really difficult. And she talks about feeling like a squeezed lemon at the end of the day. She has this really striking phrase, and then she has to come back and do it again. And she has this remarkable thing about developing a kind of a sympathetic illness. I'm always slightly dubious about this. She talks about one of the illnesses that people got in the camp based on sort of starvation and exhaustion. And she says that she developed this herself and had to have treatment for it. It's a phlegmon. It's a sort of some kind of bleeding under the skin, I think. I'm not sure exactly what the condition is. It's something that camp inmates developed quite frequently as sort of an abscess. And she says she got this herself and had to be treated for it. And she thinks it's the sort of sympathetic sort of suffering with them. I'm slightly dubious about this, but it's interesting that she would make the connection in that way. She says, look, there's a physical toll that that I'm going through here. So that's one thing. That's like an extreme form of identification almost with the witnesses. And that's when she's talking to the television station, she talks about this. But other times she presents herself as a professional. She's paid much more than the other interpreters. Right? There's a pay scale, depending on the difficulty of the work that you do. And she's paid actually a lot more than some of them, more than twice as much in her hourly rate than some of the interpreters. The archive records people protesting about this, incidentally, which is kind of interesting. But there's she actually is also paid more than the law allows for, specifically, which is, so the judge is the one who sets these rates, and he values her work so much that he gets her a pay rate which is above what you should be paid for this kind of work, right? This is really fascinating. There's an argument about this because the accountants get hold of this after the trial and say, look, why is she being paid so much? And so there has to be a kind of a justification for it. The judge writes a letter in support of her. She writes a letter where she presents herself as the kind of consummate professional, being able to learning all the vocabulary of the trial, being a legally qualified professional. There's a lot of specialized vocabulary that she had to learn in 3 different languages, right? And also dealing with people who are trying to speak one language but keep slipping into another. So many of the Polish witnesses slip into Yiddish backwards and forwards, and that's quite difficult to deal with. That sort of multilingualism of many of the Jewish witnesses in particular. So she talks about that, and she doesn't really talk about the kind of emotional difficulty there because that's not relevant to the law. So she's presenting herself in different ways for different audiences. So I think we have to be a little bit careful of saying this is how she felt about it. I think she's smart enough to be able to say, I need to present myself in this way in order to justify my work in this situation. So it's against another trust issue.
That is really fascinating when you try and think about there's so many abstract and undefinable parts about this experience that to try and, qualify and quantify what it is worth is such a weird kind of concept to get into.
It is, but you're dealing with that in the court, and the bureaucracy needs these justifications, and people reading journalism need a different kind of justification, right? Because that's what they're interested in. But you can, if you think about some of the other interpreters, there's the guy who interprets between Yiddish and German, who is almost certainly a survivor himself. He has a different relationship to the witnesses that he's interpreting for. So there are people that come from the US and they give their testimony in Yiddish. And he's clearly going to have a different relationship to the witnesses and the way they're speaking about their experiences than perhaps somebody who's just learned how to be an interpreter.
Yeah, it shows exactly why your Leverhulme project is needed, because it sounds like there are just so many different approaches to this that they need to be documented and scaled in order to actually get that comprehensive idea of everything. It's unique and individual and filtered through one person each time to try and capture.
That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, there are 16 interpreters that they use, right? And all sorts of these different languages, and each of them has a different style. Each of them develops different relationships with the people. Each of the witnesses wants a different thing from the interpreter, right? Some of them are very, they know exactly what they want, and they're very confident, and they just speak and then they say their words and that's it. Some of them are really uncertain and absolutely terrified. There's one woman, Helene Goldman, who's a former Czech Jew, a survivor who moved to the United States after the war, and she comes back and wants to speak in English, and she talks to her interpreter at times about how scared she is of the situation, right? So the interpreter for her is a person that she can sort of confide in, because everything else seems absolutely terrifying, right? The judges are sort of sitting up on this kind of dais and sort of questioning her. So that again is a relationship. The judge intervenes and stops them doing it at times because it interferes with proceedings. But you can see how, for the witness, a survivor, that would be an emotionally really difficult situation to be in, and therefore the interpreter becomes a person that you hold on to.
Yeah, I mean, to hear your own voice mirrored through someone else must make you identify with them in some level.
Of course,
that sort of anchor.
Yeah.
And not to, turn it around and then kind of ask you about your own translation practices. But one thing that I thought was really interesting when we were emailing before is that you said that before this project and this article, you're really focusing on written testimonies versus verbal testimonies, such as those given at trials. How do you find this transition from written to spoken translations for your own practice? What are some of the differences or similarities to your own approach with this?
It's a really good question, this. And obviously working on written translations, it's just easier. The material's more easily available. You've got more time. But if you think about translation activity, right? If you think about something like the Holocaust, which was a hugely multilingual event, quite apart from it, there were people from all sorts of different countries coming together, being concentrated in specific places, and also testimony giving afterwards as well. The vast majority of that stuff is spoken. It happens moment by moment. People are doing language support, lots of informal interpreting, lots of language brokering, going on with people who are fluent in these languages, supporting people who aren't. If you think about people kind of coming together in a ghetto, being transported there from across occupied Europe and beyond, they're having to cope with that situation, and people are needing to kind of translate for them. They're relying on understanding, getting information as quickly as possible. It's really hard to reconstruct, but it's fascinating. I would really like to be able to, but it's just, you rely on secondhand testimonies, you rely on people talking about this kind of thing, which of course is not exactly, there are testimonies of concentration camps where people talk about the linguistic issues there. Primo Levi is perhaps the most famous example, but there are plenty of others. So written testimonies are just a really, really small and unrepresentative fragment of that kind of stuff, but they've been very, very influential. And so writing about those in terms of their translation has been really interesting, how a testimony crosses cultural and linguistic barriers and is received in a different language by different people has been a really interesting project for me. But there's loads and loads of work been done on this, for many years now. I found this interpreting, I sort of came to it slightly by chance, and discovering this incredible material that the Fritz Bauer Institute's curated, where we can suddenly hear this, and then familiarizing myself with the research on courtroom interpreting. There are many years of research that you can draw on there. And also research on interpreting at the Nuremberg trials, the Eichmann trial, the other genocide trials like Yugoslavia or Sierra Leone. There's lots of research there that you can draw on. Now, Frankfurt's quite unique, but there's still, what I find the immediacy of it, what happens with this kind of interpreting, really fascinating, and trying to find ways of reconstructing the sort of the discursive context of this kind of speech, this kind of relationships between the people, really, really fascinating. So I suppose, that's, I don't quite know whether that's an answer to that question, but that's why I shifted anyway, from one to the other.
I mean, it's one of those things today that we're probably going to be seeing more and more.
Yeah.
What is going to be considered worth translating in these trials that we're going to have in the future, there's now going to be TikToks of, witness testimonies. So one thing that I kind of wanted to ask as well is, given the current crisis that's kind of happening right now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what relevancy do you see this work on translating testimony might have today or potentially in the future, given how everything works out?
Yeah, I'm always kind of slightly hesitant about talking about the relevance of my research for these kind of present crises. I don't think you need my research to see the necessity of people getting quick access to information in languages that they can use, right? That work is going on, in Ukraine and around the borders of Ukraine at the moment. And, you don't need my research in order to help find ways of getting people's voices heard in situations where they need to be heard, right? If you think also of the asylum system and the courts, they always rely on interpreters and language specialists. And I think what's become clear to me is that they're really the most important part of the system. But they're often the least well understood and least well supported. Courts don't always really appreciate what they do. They don't get paid particularly well. There's not enough. I mean, this is a Europe-wide phenomenon in terms of not really funding language support for refugees in any adequate way. Now, I don't think my research really helps with that concretely. I think it's much more important to support really brilliant international organizations like Translators Without Borders, for example, as an organization that does work across the world, helping people get access to this kind of information. And they are working in Ukraine, as far as I can see, helping people, access the information that they need. And campaigning for a decent approach to refugee policy across Europe as well. I just think that's something that anybody can do, and you don't really need research for it. I suppose what my research is about is the kind of a more longer term thing in helping to ensure that the voices of the victims of violence, oppression, and genocide are actually heard effectively, in the long term, right? So thinking of people in the 1960s speaking, how can we hear their voices now? What can we hear now that wasn't heard back then? And I think making that known again is really, really important, because that's clearly still relevant to things that are happening, how these people speak, how the court makes it possible for them to speak, but also kind of shapes and sort of restrains their speech in certain ways, and what role interpreting that plays in helping them to be heard or not heard. And I think translation scholarship's got a really important role to play in this. And one of the things I'm really pleased about is working at Edinburgh, because I think in this school we have some really leading scholars doing this kind of work. There's translation studies is really strong here, and their work is concentrating on these kind of really urgent issues. So my colleagues like Charlotte Bossel, she works on translating the testimonies of survivors of gender-based violence, for example. Shebnem Suzan Sarayeva working on Turkish women's access to translated material about maternal and neonatal health, another thing, right? Hepzibah Israel looks at the traces of translation in British colonial archives, right? So a historical approach, but we're still hugely relevant. Mavis Ho, who works on translation technology, but has also been a practicing court interpreter in Edinburgh. So there's this real strength here, I think, in Edinburgh and in our school that makes us quite an important centre and helps me feel sort of supported in what I'm doing. So the relevance is really in these kind of longer term issues, and making space for victims' voices always to be the thing that people pay most attention to in any legacy of conflict or violence or genocide.
And it's true, Edinburgh University and LLC in particular is really an amazing place to be inspired in translation studies, and to have those amazing points to look towards if you're a student or you're thinking about getting into translation studies. And then one thing I kind of wanted to say, I know you spoke on this a little bit already, but when I thought a really fascinating part about your own articles, of course, being based in the University of Edinburgh, is that it will once again be translated from the original language and then into English. So I wanted to know, when launching this project about the practice of translation and the ethics and how it's done, has this material formed your own views on translation as a practice?
I found this really difficult, because you have to transcribe these testimonies, And sometimes the witnesses are speaking in 3 or 4 different languages at once, right? And finding a way of making that available to a reader of English is really tough. So I suppose it's always just being clear about what you're doing. So we always translate sources, right? If we work with historical sources or sources of testimony or whatever it happens to be, we work with translated sources. We do this all the time, but we don't always acknowledge what we're doing. We don't always talk about the translation as the kind of key important issue here. Often what we're doing, and historians do this a lot, and I know I've done it as well, is we translate something in order to prove a point. And that may affect the way we translate it. Because there was always various different ways you can translate, and we might choose the one that actually supports our particular point. And we do this without really thinking. So it's always something to guard against. And it's really tough to make these multilingual testimonies available to an English reader while still enabling them to see what the interpreters are doing and what happens when a witness is. I mean, for example, there's a witness called Simon Gotland who starts off wanting to speak in French, but his French isn't good enough, so they send away the French translator and they call Kapkajew in. He's a Polish Jew who survived Auschwitz, survived the worst of Auschwitz. He was a member of the Jewish Sonderkommando, doing the kind of worst work in the gas chambers and crematoria, and managed to survive. Went to France. He gives his testimony in sort of 4 different languages, right? So they start him off with the French interpreter, but he wants to speak German because he wants to speak directly to the court. His German gets mixed up with his Yiddish a lot, and it becomes very hard to follow. Then they provide a Polish interpreter for him, but he keeps slipping backwards and forwards into these languages depending on what he's talking about, right? Sociolinguistically, it's a really, really interesting testimony. But it's very, very hard for the interpreter to deal with. She keeps trying to bring him back to Polish the whole time. But actually, he wants to speak German. And there are times when he's talking about things that only really work in Yiddish because that's the language that he spoke to his fellow prisoners in. And it seems to be, the court thinks this is all confusion. But actually, it's a really powerful testimony because it tells us something about the language use of multilingual victims who never really found a place in one of the kind of national cultures after the end of the Second World War. Now, how do you make that understandable to an English reader without lots of diacritics and multicolored things to show which language he's doing in? Sometimes I can't tell whether he's trying to speak German or Yiddish. Because the words are so similar, and I don't know whether he's thinking it's Yiddish or German or not. I just can't tell. So if you translated that as a historical source, you just get rid of all that stuff and say, right, these are the things he's talking about. But I don't want to ignore these linguistic issues because I think they tell us about his voice and his experiences, both during his time in Auschwitz and also afterwards as a migrant, as a refugee. And they're about the feeling of the testimony, about the voice, and also about the interaction with the court and with the interpreter and the judge. So I'm going to have to find a form of transcription that is not completely alienating for the reader, but actually conveys them that information. I don't know yet how I'm going to do it, but there are plenty of models that I can draw on, so I'm sure I'll find something.
Kind of getting into a little bit of, I guess, more lighthearted topics. Not that any of this wasn't in some way a very powerful statement about human empathy, I guess, and also how to translate that on an institutional level, which is so fascinating. But I know you teach a lot of classes at the University of Edinburgh. Some of them I'm sad that I'm a PhD student and not able to take as many classes because some of them looked really fascinating when I was looking through your profile. But what are some of your favorite classes to teach, and why do you think that is?
I suppose, since we're talking about translation, I've always loved doing the translation classes, right? And we have translation from the first year of undergraduate right up to master's level. And I love doing it at all those levels. And we've thought really hard about how we might start to introduce students to more kind of professional approaches to translation and what do translators actually do when they're translating a text. I love doing the master's course in translation because we can really get to grips with these issues. We use lots of different text types, me and the colleague who designed this course, Iloma Bodama. we work quite differently, which is great for the students. I do use some of this material with the students. I use one of these interpreted testimonies from the trial, and I asked them to imagine that they're translating this for a museum exhibit about the trial, which is going to be visited by people who are English speaking. What do you do with this, right? How do you give your English speaking listener access to what's going on here? Mm-hmm. It's a really impossible task that I'm asking them to do, but really it allows us to talk about issues of ethics and language and what testimony is and our attitudes towards it and our kind of ethical responsibilities, right, as translators. So I do love doing that kind of stuff. I've also teach classes on anti-Semitism in German literature. I mean, I started as a kind of literary person, so that's the stuff I tend to teach most of, and also on Holocaust testimony as well. And I've taught a course and finally undergraduate on Holocaust testimony for many years, in various different ways. And the one on anti-Semitism is quite new, so I'm still working out exactly what the best way is to approach that subject. But I think in just terms of sheer joy and pleasure, it's always translation, because it's such fun. It's so interesting. When students really get hold of what they're able to do as translators with a text, that it's not about getting things right or wrong, but it's about thinking, well, how am I going to make this text available to people in a new situation? Then you can really do something with it. And I absolutely love what they come up with. They're always really special.
And so I know you said you've been at the University of Edinburgh for a while now. So I just wanted to know, during your time here, have you gotten a chance to explore Scotland? Yeah. And if so, where has been your favorite place in Scotland to visit or to stay, or even just last time, our guest said her favorite place was Mary's Milk Bar. So if you have a favorite ice cream shop as well, that's also a valid.
Right, good. Okay.
Yeah.
It's sort of, it's weird. I mean, I'm not a great person for the great outdoors particularly, which is a bit odd for somebody who's, Scotland's my home. I've always been a big city person, really. I grew up in a small town, and I think people who grow up in small towns tend to like big cities more than anywhere else, because they just offer us more than we had when we were growing up. So I lived in Manchester for a while, and Berlin, and those are two cities that I really love. Obviously, Edinburgh and Glasgow are amazing cities, and I've lived in Edinburgh for a long time now, and I really love it here. And I was trying to think about what my favourite place would be. And I think if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have probably said, one of the pubs in Edinburgh, probably, like the Bow Bar on Victoria Street or something like that, where I've had some very happy moments. But a couple of years ago, I went to Orkney for the first time. And there was a particularly special place there, which is the Ness of Bodgar. I don't know if you know that. It's a sort of a narrow strip of land between a freshwater lake and the sea. And there's a settlement on it. There's a little kind of village on it. And a few years ago, relatively recently, they discovered a huge archaeological site underneath this. I mean, just massive, right? There's already been a stone circle there, right? It's not quite, looking quite similar to Stonehenge, and that's, I think, slightly older than Stonehenge, in this incredible landscape. But they discovered this site, this Neolithic site, which is massive, like an enormous settlement, very rich, with a history that seems to have spread over several hundred years. And it's being excavated now for quite a while. They can only excavate a couple of months a year because of the weather conditions. But if you go and visit it, you're in the middle of this landscape, which seems very lonely, but actually was once incredibly rich and right in the center of a civilization. That was really spectacular. I mean, it was an amazing day because it was beautiful weather, and we had curlews and larks and birds of prey and all sorts of things, happening at the same time. So that was a very special memory to me. But I would say that I don't know if it's exactly my favorite place, but it's the place that I've been most impressed by, and the place where I've had a kind of a shock of sort of strangeness but recognition when I got there. I thought that was absolutely amazing, and I definitely want to go back there.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things about the Highlands and the beauty of the Orkneys and the Isles is that it really, I think, asks you to kind of just focus on the landscape. So
Yeah,
sometimes I think it's easy to forget about the people, but you're so right about finding that
yeah.
there have been people there for so long must be that sort of moment of awe.
Yeah, depth. That's it's. I think the landscape is anher place that I really like, and it's the around the Culloden Museum just outside Inverness.
Mm,
I don't normally go for battlefield reconstructions very much, but that is a really spectacular museum in the middle of an incredible landscape,
yeah,
with a really interesting way of telling the story and questioning sort of common perspectives on it. The Jacobite
yeah.
Rising. So, yeah, I think everything's kind of embedded in this landscape
Yeah.
in a way which does make you feel that you're part of something bigger, shall we say.
Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been an absolutely fascinating time listening to you, and avoiding my own work to listen to yours is much more satisfying than
Well, thank you
otherwise.
so much.
Beyond the Books is a podcast from the University of Edinburgh's School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures. I'm Emma Aviette, and thank you so much for listening.